Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video on a really rainy, overcast, early summer evening in London. I'm going to talk about this book, Jon McGregor, Lean Fall Stand, which is his latest book, came out this year. Now, I have a very checkered relationship with Jon McGregor. I read his first two books, and even The Dogs, and If No One Should Speak of Unremarkable Things, and really didn't get on with them at all. And in fact, I devoted a sort of thematic video on BookTube to talking about minimalist writing, where I presented McGregor as one example of minimalist writing, and the sort of nouveau romance, sort of psychological fiction of Alain Robbe-Grillet and Nathalie Sarraute as a different and I think more satisfying way of doing minimalist writing. So those first two books of McGregor's I read, which are his first two books, and one, if not both, won literary prizes. They're very small scale. They're about the everyday, the mundane, sort of community life. And they were just very, nothing really happens. Even though I bought into the realistic nature of the work, it was just a drab, dull read, really hard to, nothing to power you through it, sort of observational in that sense rather than dramatic. And that was it for me. I wasn't prepared to read him anymore. And when Reservoir 13 came out, which is possibly his most successful book, which is one of the ones before this, I just, even though all the hullabaloo around it, I just couldn't bring myself. It still sounded sort of minute detail about a community of people, even though it was centred around a sort of a tragic accident or incident. I mean, I don't know because I haven't read it. But I saw Bob the Booker talk about this on his channel, and this sounded like it was doing something very different. It was not about minimalism. It was actually doing something quite daring with language. That's what intrigued me. So what it is, it's divided into three parts. Part one is a polar, he's not really an explorer. He and two colleagues are in a base station mapping geoscience in the Antarctic. And it's quite vividly pictured, just what a sort of beyond word expanse is down there, with very, very few landmarks because it's all snow and ice. And it is sort of beyond words, and in this case almost beyond photos, because one of the three is a sort of photographer. That's his hobby, and it's his first time there, unlike the main character, Doc Wright. Doc being a nickname, he's not a medical doctor. And Doc Wright suggests that if one of them goes and stands halfway up a sort of small glacier or whatever, that should at least give the sense of scale and perspective, because otherwise, you know, you look at this sort of vast expanse of ice and snow, and it doesn't, you know, you can't grasp it unless you're actually there. A photo can't capture it. So they're doing this in their sort of downtime, and a sudden storm hits and separates the three of them, and ends up with Doc, who is sort of he's the one who's gone to stand to give perspective, sort of up a glacier or whatever it is. He is trying to get down, and it's really difficult in the conditions, and he suffers a stroke. Now, it's not specified, but I suspect it's sort of the exertions of the environment on him causes his brain to burst a blood vessel, and that causes a stroke. And so he's sort of out for the count, and luckily for him he's rescued when they don't check in at their pre-agreed time with the main base. And he doesn't really know, you know, he's out of it. As I say, he's had a stroke. And, you know, it's a sort of a tragic mission. Now, I don't think that's a spoiler. So that's part one. And as I say, it was quite effective. Interestingly, this is what happened to me. The sound of the storm softened as a drift built back up against the door. He numbed at the rubbedness of his face. I thought, well, that's bad. That's bad sub-editing. They've completely missed that. And then gradually, lower down in the page, you get, he emptied his glass. He eased himself to his feet. He roared the rum numbness of his face. No, rubbed the rum rawness, no, radio, etc., etc. This, he's had a stroke, so he's lost control of language, which I realised that, wasn't down to bad sub-editing. So I thought, aha, this is going to be interesting. This is right up my street. And more about that at the end of this video. Part 2 is his sort of beginning of his sort of rehabilitation in a hospital in Santiago, Chile, which is the sort of nearest major city to where they flew him from on the Antarctic. And then he's flown home to Cambridge, to a hospital there, to continue his rehabilitation. And his wife has flown out to Chile and then flies back home to sort of, get ready to receive him back in the house, where he's lost a lot of capacity and is still struggling with language. And interestingly for me, that second section, that middle section, is really about the wife as a carer and just how difficult it is, and the demands that are put on you, and you have no training. Can the relationship survive that? I did think that was very poignant. Less about his state and more about hers as the carer. And then we have sort of part 3, the final part, which is about he's back home. He's got limited mobility. He's still struggling with language. But there's been a lot in part 2 and the start of part 3 about the lack of money and the lack of resources means that the speech therapist that was working with him could only, was withdrawn after a time. And part of what was so difficult for his wife is that she was never really told what was happening or given an advance due notice, and sort of, people turn up to sort of give him tests that, she had no knowledge of. And that sort of continues or opens part 3, whereby he is encouraged to go to effectively a sort of an occupational therapy group for other people who've lost the powers of their speech, which is sort of basically a private initiative by a woman who's sort of managed to secure funding for this. And there's a group of them, and it's very fractured, the narrative, in a group setting, because none of them can fully enunciate what they want to say. And we pass, because it's a group session, we pass from one to another to another. So it's quite fractured, and it's quite frustrating because you never sort of get to a certain point in somebody's story in a session, and then they move on to somebody else because it has to be fair. Now, interestingly, the two main sort of helpers, one is this woman, it's a private initiative, who sort of is making it up as she goes along, and she's sort of full of insecurities about whether she's doing it right. And Doc Wright's speech therapist, who attended him at home, but then there wasn't the money for it anymore. And she is sort of the supervisor of the woman who's leading this session. And neither of them come across as very nice, or they're not motivated by sort of pure reasons. They're a bit sort of full of themselves. And the people who come across it is one of the initiatives is they get in 3 dancers who are there to sort of help encourage movement in these people. Some of them are in wheelchairs and stuff. And those 3 dancers, or particularly the lead one called Rachel, was so empathic and sympathetic. The way, she was a professional dancer, and yet here she was, not being medically trained or trained in physiotherapy, but she was responding intuitively with the movement that she would mirror or lead for each of these people who had different abilities of movement. And I thought she was a stunning creation. I wasn't interested in the 2 leaders of the workshop sessions. I wasn't really interested in Doc Wright's progress. As I say, it was very much diluted because we're taken through all the others. So each section had its strengths and had its weaknesses. So the strength of section 1 was the landscape, the unremitting landscape, and the fact that it was beyond words, that you couldn't encapsulate it. Section 2 was his wife, the position of a carer, and section 3 was this dancer Rachel, and how she just was so humane. The other thing I liked was that some little bits of, it is about language and loss of language and stuff. So, when he first comes home and sort of people are writing to the wife and writing to him, you know, how are you? Terribly sorry to have heard the news, etc., etc. And McGregor writes, you know, people were lost for words. People didn't know what to say, which is kind of the position that poor old Doc Wright is in through his you know, his stroke. And also here, as I say, you know, there were occasions where the wife doesn't know what's going on and men just turn up. So these are two men who've turned up to basically make the house not sort of childproof, but sort of, you know, putting rails and stuff up for someone who suffered a stroke to be able to help them walk down the stairs and stuff. After her assessment, Anna didn't know that they were coming today, and they told her that that wasn't unusual. Left hand, don't know what the right hand's doing half the time, one of them said. Again, a very poignant expression of a stroke victim, that often you lose the use of one arm and one hand. So these guys tossing out a casual idiom of, well, management is rubbish, you know, they don't talk to each other, don't communicate. But it's a bigger picture of someone who suffered a stroke. Their left hand isn't being talked to by their brain in the same way as the right hand, or vice versa, whichever one, you know, you can lose in a stroke, depending which side of the brain the stroke's happened on. So there were little things like that that I really liked. But as a whole, I didn't enjoy the whole novel particularly. I mean, I give this 4 stars. I thought it was very solid, and there was lots of good bits, as I've just highlighted. So I return to this thing about it's about language, and you know, when that section I read of the first time I encountered words being mangled because the stroke had sort of broken some of the receptor endings, and that attacked his language capabilities. That should be fascinating, but, and I think this is what makes my position as a reviewer perhaps unique in relation to this book. I can't remember exactly how many years ago, but I wrote a short story called Just Aphasia Going Through, and then I got a video artist to turn it into a kinetic typography video, which is with movable type in a video, spelling out the story. And the point of my story is, again, there was someone who had a tumour that was pressing on the language centre of their brains, so that they too were losing control of words, and words were mutating into other words. So I think readers coming to this will be absolutely sort of blown away by what he does with language here of a stroke victim. Unfortunately, I wasn't, because I've done it myself, and I've done it, you know, before here in quite similar circumstances of brain injury, traumatic brain injury. Now, that's not McGregor's fault, obviously, but I kind of feel I got there first. Mine's not a novel, it's a flash fiction story. I think it was about 300 words. But one of the things that really should have carried me off didn't. As I say, that's not McGregor's fault, but I've seen it done before. And yeah, that's why I think if he'd done it in a way, and I think also he didn't push it enough in this book, by the way. I think he was reporting it rather than being creative with it, which is a legitimate stance to take. You know, if you want to keep your book basically realistic rather than symbolic or linguistically playful and associative, that's fine. You don't have to go the route I went. But it meant it wasn't enough. It wasn't a feature that I thought was going to carry me away with this book. So I like individual bits, but as a whole book, it wasn't enough. But, you know, as I say, it's solid, and there are enough good bits of writing which I had not encountered in his work before that I give this 4 stars. But the problem is, it doesn't make me want to read him anymore in the future, which I kind of felt this book was a make or break. Now, I can't say it was another disappointing 2-3 star book. I'm never going to read him again. There wasn't enough in here, potential, that I thought, yeah, I'm interested to see what his next book is. So there you have it. By way of a bonus or treat, or perhaps neither of those, I'm going to splice onto the end of this video my 3-minute kinetic typography video called Just Aphasia Going Through. Okay, till next time, thanks very much.
Nation. Nation. Yep.
3.9. Nine. 3.9. 9.